I think a big part of what England's failure was as the leader of the world was to avoid World War. Like their whole point was to try to dissuade Germany from going to war. Like that was their mission, and they failed at it categorically. When you're the leader of the world, you don't really want to fight. You want to convince everyone else it's not worth fighting us. So that in that way you maintain the world order and stay the leader. England did a terrible job of that. I would posit we're not doing a great job of it right now. Welcome back, everyone, to the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. I'm JP.
And I'm Peter.
And we are glad to have you with us. Today, we're talking about World War I. There's a lot of turmoil going on right now in the world. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that. And from a historical perspective, a lot of this has happened before, which is not a very comforting thought. Peter and I are well, Peter more than I. He's more of a professional history buff. I'm more of just the guy that's likes reading books and hasn't done things too much beyond reading books. And
that's all history is. Reading books.
Well, hopefully these books will come in handy, because our hope is that we will be able to learn from what happened in World War I. Sorry, I think there's a lot more common with World War I than World War II that's happening right now, and prognosticate the current trajectory. I think it's an important time for all of us, because we don't know exactly where we're headed, but it doesn't seem good. So let's try and learn together, shall we? What do you think, Pete?
Yeah. And it's like you were saying, it's very important to be able to know what has happened in the past, because like something like right now, I think right now we are kind of potentially living in a time that will be like very closely studied as history in the future. And so we have to make our decisions right now make our decisions informed by what has happened in the past. And if we don't do that, then hopefully, I'm hoping that good decisions are made, because if we don't do that, then possibly there won't be anyone reading history in the future.
Yeah, that's right. Well, before we jump in, I want to encourage everyone to check out PinedoBrothers.com. Our new project, Project X, is live on the site. And I think there's a lot to enjoy with this new project. We think of it as the next evolution in movie making. And Peter and I were just talking about how we're going to be improving it even more in these next few weeks. So take a look, and I hope you enjoy. So on to the World War I. Can you set the stage for us a little bit, just pre-1914, Pete? What kind of alliances were existed? What was the geopolitical situation?
Yeah. So like ever since the world, I think, became so global, you had these like massive alliance systems that you see also today. There was in Europe, there was a lot of after the Protestant Reformation, there was a lot of people rearranging alliances, right? And at that point, you had like the rise of nationalism, which where different countries, different nations were rearranging their alliances based on exclusively their own interests in what their best bid for power was, instead of like what we've talked about in the past with the idea of Christendom. And so you have these new, really strong, very centralized governments arising all throughout Europe. And one of these is Germany. The Otto von Bismarck was like the dude who really unified Germany and started pushing it towards, because before that it was a collection of different kind of medieval kings.
That's something that people find hard to believe now, because when we think of Germany, we think of both the world wars, which was when they really unified the German people. Prior to that, Germany didn't really exist as a unified country. It was,
Yeah.
like you said, a scattered collection of different principalities and municipalities.
Mhm.
And that strong centralized government, it came about. Well, I'm curious though, what do you see as the cause for it wasn't just Germany, but it was a lot of different countries suddenly became so much more centralized.
Was the cause for their centralization,
Right.
or what is okay?
What's the
Um,
motivating factor for that?
well, definitely for Germany was, I think, imperial ambition. Because there were people within Germany like Otto von Bismarck that wanted to build a German empire. They
And who is that?
saw
Sorry?
what's that?
Autobahn Bismarck.
Otto von Bismarck.
Yeah.
Well, he's basically the founder of Germany as we know
Interesting.
it. He was the one that drove. He was from Prussia, Prussian part of Germany. He's the one that really led. He had this idea of a unified Germany, and he led that movement to in many cases, kind of force Germans to unify. But he would look at like countries like Britain and countries like France, and he would see them have these vast overseas empires with lands in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia, and he would be like, Germany can do it better. We are Germans, so we will do it even better. But first, in order to do that, we have to unify. So he builds this very strong nationalistic kind of movement inside of Germany. And this is very bad for the rest of Europe, because
Right.
especially like if you're Britain and you consider yourself, the top dog in Europe, and you see this movement that's building a strong new empire in Europe, that's going to very much upset the balance of power there. Because you already had existing powers, like you had France and you had the Austro-Hungarian Empire,
Mhm.
which was basically, before Germany, had been the main power in Central Europe,
Right.
Central and Eastern Europe.
It's
So
the
the
seat of the Holy
Austria-Hungarian,
Roman Empire.
sorry, what was
It's the
that?
seat of the Holy Roman Empire, which has really been the main power, the main unifying power within countries for centuries prior to this.
Hmm. Yeah, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is the most fascinating empire to me at this, like in World War One, because like you were saying, it is basically a vestige of times gone by at this point. It is the seat of the Holy Roman Empire, which, if listeners don't know what the Holy Roman Empire is, it is basically what Westerners and what Europe perceived as the successor to the Roman Empire. Um, Back in medieval times, the Holy Roman Emperor, the empire was kind of seen as the replacement for the Roman Empire, and their job was to protect and to advance Christianity in Europe and abroad. And so you still have this almost, because it's fascinating to me, because this is World War One. To me, is kind of the entry of the world into modern times.
Right.
You still have, and it's in many ways horrific, because people weren't ready and didn't understand what was about to come, because very many people, especially the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were still in that kind of almost medieval mindset.
Mhm.
Their mindset was kind of maybe centuries behind maybe what Britain had, for example.
Yeah.
Um, but they're extremely prevalent still at this time, because they rule like large portions of Europe.
Right. If the
Um,
modern person were to look at Austria now, it's like all you see that's left is the capital on the map.
mhm.
It's landlocked, it's tiny, it's completely a shat. It's just a small semblance of its former self. At the point prior to 1914, it was a real country. It was like, just like how the United States has the capabilities to make huge steps on the whole world due to its resources. Austria-Hungary also had that type of resources at its disposal.
Mhm.
And now, due to the events that we're about to explain, it doesn't have that at all. So it's
Yeah.
a complete power dynamic shift.
Right. I mean, like if you just look at the city of Vienna that time, and even after World War One, it was it was the place for art and culture. Like I think as far as art and culture, we usually think of Paris now, but like Vienna, no, was like the spot at that time where all of the artists, the musicians, everyone would gather, and that was just a thriving city.
Including at this time a young Adolf Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
Which is not a story for this moment, but he was in Vienna trying to make it on his art.
Yeah, horrifyingly.
And he couldn't hack it. He was not a good artist, which there's a lot of artists that can't hack it on their art, but he was becoming more and more bitter as his art is being pretty much ignored. Any case, so
are you saying that if someone had just bought his art, then we wouldn't have had World War II?
That's so funny. People say we should go back in time and kill Hitler. Maybe we should just go back in time and buy his art.
So if there's any like street vendors selling their art on the street, please buy their art.
You do not know what
they're capable of.
Mad dictator is lying in wait. Okay, so we have an increasingly nationalistic world, driven, as you said, by imperial desire. I would also posit driven a lot by the Industrial Revolution, where it left power. Beforehand, it was very difficult to centralize power in any way because it's everything is spread out. You know, we're an agrarian type of society, which the farmer has a big sway over what the shop seller has, you know, and it's all these smaller stretches of people spread out, which it needs to happen so that you can farm land and make things happen. But with the Industrial Revolution, everything becomes centralized into cities. People have to leave the country and they have to flock to the cities in order to survive. And the factory owners have so much more power at this point that whoever there's so much money coming in that whoever is in control of that money flow suddenly has power like you've never dreamed before. And so the oligarchs at the top of the totem pole are able to centralize and consolidate their power on a national scheme, on a national type of grand scheme of things, and make world-beating decisions unlike ever before. And then another thing that's happening is as that's in lockstep with as that's happening, you also see the decline of what you were talking about, the Holy Roman Emperor, the Holy Roman Empire, where you see that Christianity is no longer the main driving force of all these different nations. They're suddenly more interested in resources and what they can do with those resources than they are in saying, oh, we're all Christians. That was something that existed that the Austrians didn't quite understand, because how you were saying exactly, the Austria-Hungarian Empire was the seat of the Holy Roman Empire, which still saw itself as the defender of Catholics, Christians and Catholics everywhere, which is soon to be proven a sentiment that is completely impossible to carry out in any real way, and heartbreakingly impossible to carry out. So yeah, there's a lot happening, a lot of shifts happening beneath the scenes. Germany is a huge part of that. England, tell me what's going on with England right now.
Well, England is obviously, it's in the process, like you were saying, industrializing like crazy, like more than any
leading
other,
the world,
more than the United States, more than any European country. Britain is just leading the charge of industrializing like gangbusters, and that obviously is changing the very fabric of the nation. People flocking to the cities, and just like the entire like dynamic of life is changing at this time. But Britain is seen for a long time now has seen itself as the leader of the world.
Yeah.
And so any kind of new nation that's rising or growing is extremely dangerous in Britain's mind. And it's interesting to look at it too, because at this point, just because as a result of alliances and just like the diplomatic dynamic from the past, like the 1800s, 1700s. The royal families at this time, which still have like influence because like they're tied into like to the oligarchy and all of that. The families are all related. Like it's really funny because there are letters between the Kaiser of Germany and the Tsar.
Okay. So you're saying, I thought you meant all the families in England are related. You're saying all the families over all the nations in
Yes,
Europe
yeah,
are related.
there are Wilhelm II, that is the Kaiser of Germany. He is a cousin to the ruling families in England, and he used to vacation. Like he would go on when how you go to your grandmother's house for maybe like Thanksgiving or something. He would go to his grandmother's in England for like Christmas. Like that's how closely knit all of these families in Europe are. And I think that like that kind of alliance system in Europe is like it's showing its age at this point. Like that's not good enough. That used to be good enough for keeping the royal families would be friends and like they'd be family, and so that would keep the nations from warring at each other. But now you see that not even that is good enough because I think you have these industrial drive, this imperial drive that is just destroying that. And it's kind of in some ways heartbreaking, because Wilhelm II, like he gets just power hungry at this point, really. But so he's like willing to turn his back on his family, like the country that he has, like you can see in his writings, he has fond memories of going to England and vacationing there. And so, and then he also like is the same case for Russia.
Before we jump to Russia, so just to sum up on England, as we were saying, the leader of the world, the undisputed economic power center of the entire world, just like the dollar has ruled the world for the past, I guess, maybe, not 100 years, but maybe 60, 70 years. Britain has ruled the world for over 2 centuries at this point. And it's been their navy that's drawn it, that has pushed it. Ever since the defeat of the Spanish Armada and then the defeat of the Turkish navy at Lepanto, there's been no challenger to Britain's supremacy on the seas. And they've driven that trade with they've driven that power, the ability to rule the seas, to drive their trade with incredible success. So they've industrialized better than anyone. They've traded better than anyone. They have far more resources than anyone. There's no setting upon the sun. The sun never sets upon the British Empire, and it hasn't for quite some time. And that's the state of it. And you're right. You're seeing the nobilities start to fade away. Like the power of the nobles really begins to be eclipsed by a new force that's on the horizon. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Jump to Russia. Tell us more.
No, I was just gonna say it's fascinating because you see like letters between the Tsar of Russia and the Kaiser of Germany, like they were friends. They were sending letters to each other very amicably back and forth for a long time before World War I. And eventually you can see it, the tone turns where they're really like almost reassuring each other, like, no, we're not going to go to war. Like we're going to be doing, you see Russia like saying like, please, no, like we don't want a war. Like we can remain friends. And Germany reassuring them like, yeah, don't worry, we're friends. We're going to stay friends. We're cousins. But like that all very quickly just is thrown out the window. There's a very sudden and kind of whiplash of direction change.
Well, what's going on in Russia right now?
Well, Russia is way behind anyone else. Like we talked about like Austria-Hungary and Empire being behind. Like Russia doesn't even
so like suppose we have England on the 1 yard line, followed closely by Germany on the 2 yard line, and we have Austria-Hungarian Empire maybe on the 50, the 60.
And
Russia's not
even in the stadium.
Yeah.
Russia's like wandering around in the parking lot. I mean, like,
not sure how to do it. I remember at this time they had sent some spies to England to say, okay, we can't figure out this whole industrial revolution thing on our own. Like we just don't have the capability. So maybe we just go send someone over to England and like see if they can copy, just like copy, like send it back, write us a notebook and like we'll just follow the note. And they couldn't even figure out like how to write down what was happening. They were like, I don't know. Like the Tsarist Russia was so completely incapable of actually just copying what was happening in England that it was a fool's errand. But in any case, I'm sorry. All levity aside.
Yeah, which was really sad to see because it was like you were saying, jokes aside, it was hurting the nation.
Yeah.
Because you have the Tsar who has these, and just like any of the other nations at this time, has a very strong imperial ambition. But he doesn't have the industry to back it up. And this was like put on full display when Russia went to war with Japan. There was the Russo-Japanese War.
When was this?
I don't remember the exact years, but it was like either very late 1800s or very early in like 1900s. So like very shortly before World War I.
Okay. Interesting.
I think it was like late 1800s, if I'm remembering correctly. So you had this, you had Russia expanding to, expanding towards Japan, and Japan didn't like that because at this time you also have Japan rising with imperial ambition. But Japan, unlike Russia, had actually been copying the West and had been industrializing as well. And so like no one really knew about Japan at this time. And so they see like some random country like as an island way out there, and they're like, oh, Russia is going to run over this country like real easy. And Russia suffers like a completely humiliating defeat. Like they just are, the opposite happens. They're run over by Japan. And that's when like the world realizes like, oh, like actually Japan is a force to be reckoned with, and Russia is like not what we thought it was.
Right.
And so that's why I think like you have Germany being like, yeah, Russia is not going to be as much of a threat to me. But this is all leading to like, you have these people with their eyes on different lands. Everyone's just trying to grab land. Everyone's trying to gain power. And you even have the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which they've built their alliance with Germany, because they form the bulk of Central and Eastern Europe. And so everyone can feel at this point like there's going to be a breaking point, because when you have the world leading power, Britain, looking at so suspiciously at the mainland, like something is going to happen, something's going to break. And that all kind of leads to, as we know, like the assassination of Franz Ferdinand.
Yeah. One big difference, I want to talk a little bit about similarities here, about what we're seeing then, or what we saw then and what we're seeing now. And one big difference that occurs to me is that England's power was nautical. It was its navy and its trade that made it powerful. Its army, from a military standpoint, was far inferior to Germany's. It was far inferior. It was not built to be taking over lands and on a mainland. That's a little bit of a difference than what we have now. Like, obviously, navy ruling the seas is not the same as what it was back then. Now it's much more important to rule the skies. You don't want to get beaten on the seas either, but ruling the skies is what we do really well as an American military. But from a just boots on the ground perspective, our army is just, obviously it's way better than, because from a technological standpoint, we're a century later. But just looking apples to apples, what we were back what they were back then and what we are now, from a boots on the ground perspective, we're not in the same ballpark as from an American military perspective. What would you say to that?
I would agree, and I think that that's definitely a reason for hope. The danger, the one of the big differences is that no nation at the start of World War I really knew what a modern war looked like. Not even Britain, despite all the industrialization and the vast superiority of its navy.
Yeah, the only nation that knew what a modern war was at this time was America.
America, right? Because of the Civil War.
Yeah.
But England had been fighting, I should say Britain had been fighting just colonial wars for the past like 100 years. They've been fighting against rebels in Africa and Asia, and they're very cruelly putting them down. But they had no idea what fighting another industrialized nation would be like. And so I think that is an encouraging thing with us today as the United States. Like, we also haven't fought a linear warfare, like a force on two equal forces fighting each other. We haven't fought that since World War II either. So it's also been a really long time. But I think that we have a much better idea of what we're dealing with. Yeah. And as you can see, like today, as Russia goes into Ukraine, they are also not what we thought they were.
Right. Yeah, that's the big key. Whenever nations have a period of peace, people don't really know. We forget what war is going to be like, because we're still living, our playbooks are all since the last major war. And Russia, its playbook is being shown, it's just not working. It's not working at all. I'm talking about right now. We're in the here and now. The Ukrainian playbook is, well, people will be studying it to show what not to do for a long, long time. And I hope we're able to avoid. I think a big part of what England's failure was as the leader of the world was to avoid World War. Like their whole point was to try to dissuade Germany from going to war. Like, that was their mission, and they failed at it categorically. When you're the leader of the world, you don't really want to fight. You want to convince everyone else it's not worth fighting us. So that in that way you maintain the world order and stay the leader. England did a terrible job of that. I would posit we're not doing a great job of it right now. I'm not sure if Google will take us down for that, but I don't think so. I think people still have a chance of seeing this. So what it's going to be seeing if we are going to fail, just like England failed at keeping a war from happening. We're not doing we're headed the wrong way right now, as we can see. So what exactly happened? How did it start?
Well, kind of the match that lit the fire in World War I was that the Austria-Hungarian Empire had also had ambitions. It's really interesting to see, because the emperor of Austrian-Hungarian Empire, Franz Joseph I, he didn't really have any super large ambitions. He was actually a pretty honest guy. Like he had suffered a lot of heartbreak. His wife had died, and that had kind of broken him in some ways. But he was probably a pretty honest ruler. But at this time, he had the Austro-Hungarian military really, really pushing hard for expansion. And he's getting old, and I think that he stopped being able to resist kind of these tendencies within the empire. And you have his successor, Franz Ferdinand, the crown prince, his nephew, who was very much in the camp of like expansion. We're growing. He was in that military block of like, yes, we're going to be growing really and be leading the world as well. And so you have the Austro-Hungarian Empire wanting to expand into the Baltic regions of Europe, like Serbia and Bosnia, and so they have plans to expand into there. And Franz Ferdinand, who's kind of seen as one of the leaders of this expansion movement, thinks it's a good idea to go and tour a land that they have kind of taken over at this point, but that's more diplomatically. They don't really have like a military occupation there. But he's like, as a show of power, he goes down there and he's touring this city. Surprise, surprise, when he's there, the Serbian rebels assassinate him. And this obviously is a huge problem because one of the most powerful forces in Europe, their crown prince just got shot. So obviously they're going to have to do something about that. Like if someone came and shot our vice president, like that would be a problem.
Well, think about it right now. Kamala Harris was in Europe. I don't know if she's still there, but she was. Imagine if Russia assassinated a Kamala Harris, or imagine if Ukraine one of the Ukrainian people assassinated.
We would immediately be in war.
Right. So this is not some sort of something that we would not do. This is completely within the modern playbook as well. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Exactly. And so the Austria has to respond. Like they have to do something because their crown prince just got killed by this little nation in the Baltics. And so immediately, not immediately, there's like a little bit of negotiation, but very soon Austria declares war on Serbia and they move in to occupy. And now the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, obviously a lot larger than Serbia, so Serbia never stood any chance. But they start moving in. They do start experiencing problems, kind of like how you're seeing in Russia, with Russia and Ukraine today, where it's like, wow, you should have won this war a lot more easily than you did. But still, it is an overwhelming force that Austria-Hungarian Empire is sending in. All the while, Austria-Hungarian Empire is eyeing Russia and looking at it and seeing like the Russians see themselves as the protectors of the little countries in the Baltics.
Why is that?
So they're looking at them. Well, because they share some common ethnic lines. In some ways, there's a common ethnicities and common bloodlines between like the Baltic regions and Russia. And so they've kind of, as part of their imperial tendencies, they've declared themselves, we are going to advance we're going to protect the people in there, but really you can kind of see it as we're going to advance our own interests in that region.
Do you see it as almost, it could have been the Russians that were pushing for the assassination of the Archduke?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I think that in many ways, the Austrians, the Austrian military bloc that wanted to expand, I think they were also pushing for the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, because they knew that if Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, then we have to go to war. Then Franz Joseph doesn't have a choice. Then he's then forced into war. And so I think that there was a lot of scheming and behind the door, behind those kind of things between these different nations, which is very scary. You don't want that, because obviously it led to so many deaths of innocent soldiers. These people were on the farm one day and then being mowed down by machine guns the next.
Yeah.
So you have Austria eyeing Russia, and so that's why they're reaching out to Germany, hey, we think we're pretty sure that once we go to war with Serbia, Russia is going to sweep down on our lands. And so Germany's like, don't worry, I got you. If Russia does anything, we'll be there to repel them. And it's really funny because Germany is more down for this than anyone else. They're the new bulldog that's ready to go. And so it's basically just hoping against hope that Russia is going to come in to Austria and so that they can spring into action. And sure enough, Russia does go into Austria, and Germany declares war on Russia. And
here's the key coming up. Here's the key. And go ahead. Sorry.
No,
I just wanted everyone to know the most, this is what the linchpin right here, that the last stop that gets pulled.
Like this is just like you were saying, like this is the linchpin, and all of the alliance systems just kick into place. So Germany goes against Russia, but they
march the wrong direction now. They don't.
Well, they also realize that they have France and Britain on their western side.
That's it.
Who are bigger threats than Russia. They realize that Russia is not what we thought it was, and so it's not a huge threat to us. So they were saying basically they had this idea. They knew they were going to face a war on both fronts, and so they're like, what we have to do, we have to devote all our resources to the western side.
That's it.
Because that's where the real threats are.
So just to put the map in front of people, so there's Germany, northern Europe, and on the west of Germany is the French front, and on the east of Germany is the Russian front. And so the first thing that they do is they go to the western. They declare war on Russia, and they go to the western front towards France, which is really this is when there's no return.
Exactly. And so England at this point it knows it needs to get involved, but it needs some kind of justification for declaring war. They still feel like they haven't had their justification. And so Germany, their plan because they want a quick and effective victory in the West so that they can turn around and then go beat up Russia.
And this is what they expected too. They expected France to be a cakewalk.
But in order to get there the quickest way, they had to go through a tiny little country called Belgium. And so Belgium, obviously, they have no chance against Germany because they're just a tiny little country. But they have a very close alliance to Britain. And so for Britain, this is our excuse. Now we found it. Germany has invaded Belgium. Now we're at war. And so really that was, in retrospect, I don't know if maybe the German plan could have been maybe if you had taken the time to go around the other way and to not go through Belgium. The problem was that the French knew that Germany was a threat, so they had a whole huge series of forts along the German-French border. And so the German idea was that we'll win this war quickly if we just go around that through Belgium and down into France. But then by doing that, they bring Britain into the war.
But Britain would have gone in anyway. Britain would never.
I guess maybe they would have found an excuse.
Right. I mean, they would have never allowed Germany to rule the continent, because if Germany puts down France and then puts down Russia, and then that's it. It's the German, Austrian, Hungarian Empire, because they've just those are the major powers at the time. So England, the moment that Russia starts marching west, was going to find a reason. At least that's my guess at that.
But it does give them the very easy, self-righteous kind of justification for going. And studying World War I is really interesting because we as Americans, we are on the side of Britain because that they're our allies.
Right.
But you look at what Britain did and everything, they almost if you just read through these histories of what happened, you almost feel like Britain is the real bad guy, because they condescend all other nations. They're so condescending to everyone else. They literally think that they can do no wrong. Right. And so they see going through Belgium, they're like, we are the saviors. We're going to go in and avenge the poor little Belgians.
And really, I think Britain is the one that tells us the lesson here. Britain was the ultimate bad guy because it was Britain's job to keep the peace. They had the power to do it. The fact that everyone went to war shows that Britain failed at its job. Just like right now, I think it's our job to keep the peace because we have the power to do it. Britain did not do its job, and we're not doing our job because the world is devolving into war as we speak. So I really find it interesting, and I think it's something for further study, is what led England to Britain to fail so cataclysmically at its job. Was it just cockiness? Were they arrogant and they thought that everyone would just do what they would say? What do you think?
I mean, I think it's probably just a mix of many different things. I think that Britain, part of industrialization is also, at least at this time, democratization. So they were definitely a lot more of a democracy than, say, countries like Germany or Austria-Hungarian Empire. And I think that is one of the dangers. Like, I think democracy obviously is like the way to go. It's the best form of government that we can have here on earth. But you do always see more back and forth in democracy than in like a monarchy, because there are different people who come to power. Like, just like a few years ago, we had Trump, who had obviously a vastly different kind of diplomatic policy. And now we have Biden, who has a different kind of diplomatic policy. So you have different elected leaders at different times and different forces pulling in the country that affect the country in a lot bigger ways. And so I think maybe the reason Britain kind of failed to do that is because, one, like, you can't be the biggest person on the block and be apologizing to people, which is what the problem that we have today.
That's key.
So you have to be forceful and you have to be efficient, but you can't obviously be just like running over everyone, because that leads to war as well. So I think it was kind of like a combination of different things. Like, when there was political forces that were pulling different ways, and maybe like England at that time just didn't have the will to lead in the way that it needed to be leading.
Yeah, and I see some interesting parallels. I'd like to study what the British sentiment, the people's sentiment was, because right now you have this odd thing on both sides of the equation. I think for different reasons. I think one reason, so the leftist reason for not wanting to have anything to do with geopolitical, with any type of geopolitical power, is to say, well, we don't want to be imperialists. We don't want to be pushing the American ideal down everyone else's throat. And then on the other side, on the right side, you see people saying, well, it's none of our business. What do we care of what happens to Ukraine? Like, we're for America. And both of them are completely ahistorical, because if you're going to be the biggest dog on the block and you are unwilling to do what is necessary to maintain that status, someone is going to take it from you by force. This is what happened in England. People took that by force. That which England had, that's what Britain had, it was taken by force through 2 brutal world wars. And so if we're not willing to do what is necessary to maintain our status, it's not going to be peaceful. It's not going to be a peaceful transition of power to some other world order. That is going to be quite uncomfortable for us.
Yeah, and that's why it's important to kind of to be proactive, right? You can't just be reactive. You have to be proactive in leading. And it's hard to say exactly what the best way to lead is.
Right.
Because when you are the most powerful country in the world, every little thing that you do will have like ripple effects that will grow. So like, you can send like support to a nation, but that's going to be perceived in this way and that way, and then like this country will react in this way. So it's like almost treading on eggshells, but also like you have to be strong. So like how do you tread on eggshells and also be strong at the same time?
Right. It's above my pay grade to say what should be done. I guess more than anything, I'm speaking towards that popular sentiment that's growing on both the left and the right, which says, well, hands off. That type of sentiment is completely ahistorical. And there's no basis in fact, and like you're burying your head in the sand, no matter on either side. And that's really just speaking to those sentiments more than saying this is what should be done.
Exactly. I mean, it is also, I mean, it's a humanitarian crisis as well. So like it just, even on a moral level, like something has to be done. Putting aside like nationalistic levels, like you can't just allow one nation to run over another and just decimate it entirely, because that will also have ripple effects and will grow into something.
Right. I mean, absolutely. Well, walk us through real quickly the major movements in the war. Like we don't have time to go into like each step, but tell us what happens and how it ends up real quickly.
Well, yeah, just to kind of give a quick overall picture, the war continued to domino, and each successive domino was bigger than the last one. Very quickly after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, after the invasion of Belgium, Germany easily sweeps through Belgium very quickly, and they pour into France, and they get extremely close to Paris. Like they almost get all the way to Paris. Miraculously for France, they don't make it to Paris, but
and that was their objective, right? They were going to get to Paris, and then they focus on Russia.
They want to sweep into France from the north, take over Paris, and effectively taking over France, and then diverting their forces and concentrating on Russia. So this is all they're wanting to get this done very quickly. But then they run into something called modern warfare, where you have massive armies with artillery and machine guns and all of these things that Europe hadn't seen before. And this is causing massive casualties. And especially once Britain gets onto the scene, everyone starts to dig in. And you know that we like kind of our most associated image of World War I is in the trenches. You have all these forces in the trenches staring each other down. And this really is what the entirety of the Western Front of World War I turns into. The French and the British staring down the Germans from across no man's land. And so like this is a new type of warfare where the machine guns and the artillery rule the day. Unfortunately, like many nations thought that, like there were some nations that even thought that like cavalry was going to win the day. And so they sent in horses, like men on horses, and they just get mowed down.
It's not, I mean, there's a tendency for us to laugh at that, but I want to be careful, because cavalry did rule the day. In the past wars, cavalry, like that was Prussia's thing, for example. They had the best cavalry, and that's what won the day. You can't know what the future is when you're living in the present, and so if you look at just the present, it makes sense. Okay, send in the horses. This is what's worked. It's not just that they were stupid. I mean, there was stupidity that happened. Maybe they should have prognosticated a little bit better. But I think it's easy to look back and say, well, they should have known that was going to happen. There's going to be, if there is another world war, and we're headed that direction, there are going to be things that we do that people will laugh at 50 years from now, maybe 20 years from now, because we haven't done this in a while.
Yeah, and hopefully we can make somewhat better informed decisions based off of hopefully we have a better intelligence, not intellect, but intelligence as far as like being seen what's out there, right? and anticipating what kind of technology we're going to be up against. And I think we do have the capabilities to have eyes in many different places so that we can, in some ways, more anticipate better. Like if Britain and Germany had like done better, had maybe spied on, they were spying on each other. So like you kind of see like you should have known like that this was going to happen. But I guess it's like a weapon that hadn't seen in action.
Right.
And so maybe there's that. And it's also interesting to see like during World War I, like the technology that's used, like the industrialization of the world, doesn't stop once the war starts.
Right.
It continues to evolve very like rapidly, and it's changing the mindset of everyone involved. Everyone is kind of shocked and traumatized into the modern age. But also like what I was saying, like technology continues to advance. Like in World War I, we have the British Navy under Winston Churchill, who develops the first tanks. And it's funny because the tanks, they were conceived as maybe an idea to get through no man's land. So they were basically the idea that Winston Churchill and the British Navy had was like, we need to get a ship like we have in their Navy, but we need it to be on land.
Interesting.
And so they developed this, what they call it, they don't know what to call it, they call it land ships. And so they ship their land ships over to the front line inside of these boxes that they don't want anyone to know what they are. And so they just write on them tank. And so that's where we get tanks from.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. And so they break them out, they start using them. And this is where the first time that you have tanks on the battlefield. So this is like a moving, like rolling fortress. It wasn't enough to really like break the stalemate side of on the Western Front, but it was something that grew there. Also, we had the growth of the use of tear gas on soldiers, which is also a terrifying like new development. As you have planes developing who start dropping bombs or start being used for reconnaissance. And so like everything is just evolving very quickly at this time.
Yeah.
It's very fascinating.
So draw us to a close. How do we break the stalemate, and how does this end?
So basically the stalemate on the Western Front is almost never broken. They keep on pounding away at each other, which really just goes to show the power of like Germany, that they are holding their own against the world's leading power and France, and kind of winning. Austria-Hungary is basically useless because they are inept, basically. They're at war in the Baltics with Russia, and also with Italy, because Italy at first had promised to be on with Germany and Austria, but then they switched sides and started attacking Austria because the Allies, England, had promised Italy, like, if you come on our side, we'll give you portions of Austria. So like, sounds good. But Italy is the only nation that Austria can beat. And so they beat them. But then you have, this continues to grow, and it continues to get bigger and grow outside of Europe. You have the Ottoman Empire, which sees this as an opportunity to grow as well. And so they side with Germany and Austria. And they also want to grow in the Baltic regions. And so they're like, hey, we're here for you, Austria. And so you have war in Turkey as well. And then you have war on the seas. You have, of course, like all of these are empires. And so they have lands overseas. They have lands in Africa, they have lands in Asia, in America. And so all of these forces go to war with each other as well. So This is why it's called World War, because it's not just centralized in Europe. Like that's where it's the main part of it is, but you also have war across the world just breaking out.
Yeah.
And because of this overseas conflict, and because of the United States alliance with England, you have America very quickly being like, we might have to get involved with this because of, for various reasons. And America tries to stay out of it for years, but eventually it becomes untenable to stay out of it. And so we enter the war, and that kind of is the final push that the Allies needed in order to defeat Germany.
Well, we have that huge advantage in that we just fought the Civil War. So we've already studied modern warfare and learned from it. We've learned our hard lessons with how many Americans dying? What was it? 750,000 Americans dead, something like that. And so that lesson, thankfully, is one that we learn from, and we don't just say, okay, we're going to toss people into the trenches and we're going to attack well fortified positions, because we know that doesn't work. Enough people have died. And so that is a huge advantage to us at this point.
But not to mention, like, we're also like, if the United States had not entered the war, Germany would have eventually just destroyed England and France, because they were close. Like, they were exhausted, but they were making moves and adjusting so that they were winning. They were starting to defeat France. And so if not for the United States, then very quickly England and France would have been in huge trouble. And so, the United States enters, and that kind of, it's fresh, it has the knowledge of a recent war, and it is also hasn't been fighting in this war for a few years, and they haven't been stuck in the trenches for years. And so their new force is it provides like a shot of energy to the Allies. And it's really fascinating to look at. I always really love reading about World War I, because you still have like the colonial powers, which is really crazy to think about, like colonial powers in a modern age, because you have people, like armies were sent from Canada and from like Australia to fight, and also like from Africa sent to fight for Britain, because Britain is their overlord.
Britain's emptying the tank. Britain's emptying the tank, and if their tank contains the whole world, and then they're going to empty the whole world.
Which is, I think it really, there are a lot of lessons to be learned for sure. But when we have like the Battle of Gallipoli in Turkey, which is super fascinating to me, because we have Australians were the main fighting force, fighting Ottomans, fighting the Turks in like the Mediterranean. And like, I think everybody was looking at each other like, what the hell? Like, what is happening? Because like you have the Turks who are like looking at the Australians and like, we hate the British, and the Australians are like, we hate them too. Like, what is going on?
It's a tragedy. It really is a tragedy, and of epic proportions. And I'm sorry, we're running out of time, so I want to move forward. What is the immediate? I think the immediate aftermath. So the combined forces of France. Well, really, it's the combined forces of Britain and the U.S. carry the day. And what happens?
And so at the end, the Allies are victorious just by overwhelming force, right? Because basically Germany ends up almost completely on its own, because Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans do what they can, but there's a very quick limit to what they can do. So Germany is pretty much on its own against the rest of the world.
As in the words of Norm Macdonald, Germany manages to declare war on the world and almost wins.
Oh man, yeah. And so they are eventually defeated by overwhelming force. And you have the peace talks between the different nations that the treaty and the treaty ends up being signed, called the Treaty of Versailles, which
effectively sets up World War II.
Yeah, which is an atrocity, a historical giant, like one of the largest mistakes in history, I would say.
And there's two people responsible for that atrocity, really. I mean, one is Woodrow Wilson, who came from the United States with his grand ambition to create a League of Nations, which he comes without any real knowledge of how Europe actually works. So he creates countries out of thin air for this League of Nations, like Czechoslovakia, people that don't like the Slovaks and the Czechs, we're the Czechs, by the way, don't even like each other. And he just suddenly thinks, well, this works, they're close to each other. So let's make a nation here. And of course, England is like, they're like nudging each other in the shoulder, like in the ribs, like, look at this American guy. He thinks he knows what he's talking about. So it's definitely a travesty.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lesson to be learned about like diplomacy there, because we rescued, like as the United States, we rescued the Allies, and so we should have had all of the bargaining power.
Right.
But somehow the leader of the nation that went and rescued everyone has no bargaining power.
Right.
Is looking at it as a joke. Again,
that's Woodrow Wilson going. He's a pencil neck, basically, and he's marching along with all these other, like the British diplomats just completely make a fool of him. It's almost as if he is old and out of touch and thinks that he still has a quick wit when he doesn't, and doesn't have the humility to say, let's send someone else who actually can still bargain and get a good deal, who actually can strike fear into the other people at this bargaining table. It's almost as if, he forgets on a regular basis who the president is, and calls the vice president the president. It's almost as if, he can't string two sentences together without forgetting what his name is. It's almost like that, but not quite.
I've never heard of a situation like that at all. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Right. Well, I think that the travesty that ended World War I made it inevitable that World War II was going to happen. Mm-hmm. We can't go through all the ins and outs, but basically we set up a situation in Europe that was a tinderbox for another war. And Germany was rightfully furious over all the indignities that happened during that peace treaty. And Germany still has the capabilities to make people hurt when they're angry. So it was a tinderbox waiting to blow up. But I think a big key to it is what happens in Russia at this point, because the czars are basically on their way out at this. Everyone realizes that Russia is completely incapable of doing anything, and including keeping down this Bolshevik tendency that's rising inside Russia, led by Lenin. So that really sets this World War I sets the stage not just for Hitler, but also for Lenin, which dictate the power struggle of the next century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it's a very formative time after World War I, that the world is rebalancing, and it's finding its new power structure. And it's a power structure that was built on the vengeance of France and Britain. And I think when you have something that's built on vengeance, it's going to lead to more war in the future.
Vengeance and star-eyed optimism, just ridiculous, without any knowledge of what's actually going on. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think we need to sum this up. We're well over an hour now.
Okay.
where should we, I think I'd like to set up a part 2 actually, where we talk about what happens in Russia after this, in the immediate aftermath, because we see, the frightening thing that I see is, so we see a lot of World War II or World War One, the foreshadowing of what happened then repeating itself, and history has a scary way of doing that. But we also see a lot of what's happening in Tsarist Russia happening in the United States as well. And I think if you and I could go through that maybe next week, what do you think?
Yeah, that would be fascinating to talk about. We'll definitely dive into that.
Great. All right. Well, Pete, thanks for the fascinating conversation. I'm going to go tell my wife about where tanks come from.
Yeah. No, thank you. I apologize for I blame it on the time change.
Daylight saving.
I don't know how to deal with the sun anymore. So.
Peter, don't worry. It's good to know while we're headed towards World War III, the Senate is laser focused on that evil daylight savings times. They're voting about it. They're going to take care of it for us.
It's confusing. It's causing problems. So.
All right. Well, everyone, thanks so much for joining us. We're the Pinedo Brothers, working to revitalize the world of Catholic art through film. Check us out. Our new project on pinedobrothers.com is called Project X. We think you'll like it. I'm JP.
I'm Peter. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Pinedo Brothers Podcast, an artist podcast for Catholics. We hope you enjoyed it, and if so, please consider subscribing, and commenting below. That really helps. This episode was edited and recorded by me, JP. Makeup was done by no one, if you couldn't tell. The Pinedo Brothers are Catholic filmmaking brothers working to revitalize the world of Catholic art through film. For more information on us, check us out at pinedobrothers.com. Thanks again.